My name is Mary Miller, and those of you that were on the call earlier, you heard that I work for the New York News Publishers Association. And we're here tonight to talk about the fight for truth in media. Oh, there we go. If you find yourself questioning the news you see and hear, that you're not sure if it's 100% accurate or even real, you are not alone. This statistic from the Pew Research Center says that there's quite a number of people that are skeptical. And I think healthy skepticism is a good thing to have, especially with the quantity of news and information that we are bombarded with on a daily basis, in print, over the airways, and on the internet. But that said, there's still a certain amount of information that you want to be and need to be true. We all need the information that is pertinent to our daily lives, especially with things like the coronavirus, that it's become even more important than ever, and actually life-saving for us to have accurate information. So I wanted to share this cartoon. I think cartoonist Scott Adam got into my head a little bit while I was preparing for this event. This actually made me laugh out loud. But you have to understand that Dilbert is just trying to get both sides of the story, and yet he's being attacked for following both sides of the story. Very, very funny. Okay. Many people have started to get their news and information from social media. About half of Americans get their information from social media. Occasionally, 1 in 5 US adults say they get their news primarily through social media as of this study, which was completed in July of 2020. And according to Common Sense Media, 6 in 10 teens get their news from YouTube and social media sites. 75% say it's important for them to follow current events, and their news habits reflect the diversity of the modern media landscape. Their results show that while they get their news and information from social media, they don't necessarily trust it as much as they do traditional news sources. So we have this new communication landscape. The message is created by the center. If we look at the center of this, the message is created by professional journalists, and it's sent out to the audience. But anybody with a cell phone now can make media, in addition to share media. And the sharing and the creation of media messages by people other than professional journalists continues to blur the line of what's authentic news and what's some other form of either misinformation, disinformation, or shared information. So, truth versus fact. We can probably all agree that this is an apple. That's fact. But facts are often a part of our perception. So, as professional journalists or people in media, we ask, what do we know? How do we know it? How can we find out more? And sometimes it's just a matter of perspective. So, fact versus truth, it might be just a matter of context, and context can sometimes be manipulated. The good news is, the good news is that over half of Americans desire a personal connection with their news sources. And if they have that connection, they have strong feelings that are good, that tell us that we're doing the right thing. So they approve of what we're doing if they have that connection. And tonight we have that personal connection with our panelists. In the professional media panelists that we have here tonight, we have Peter Crowley from the Adirondack Daily Enterprise, Andy Flynn from the Lake Placid News, Brandon Loomis from the Adirondack Explorer, and Emily Russell from the North Country Public Radio. We have 3 student panelists here today, and they'll be speaking a little bit more about how they personally get their news and information, and how they determine if that news and information is reliable, and how they determine whether they'll share it or not. The event is being hosted by North Country Community College. Thank you very much for your support in this, and with support from the Cloud Splitter Foundation. So with that, I would like to invite Peter Crowley to respond to the questions that were given to him. Peter?
Hello. Hi, Mary. Thanks.
Hi.
So questions, I have a list here in front of me. And the first is, what is your process for gathering and disseminating news and information to your audience? Well, first we have to find news. And so that is, we do that all kinds of ways. From attending, government meetings, for instance, and checking police reports and fire reports and checking in every day. We check in every day with our police and fire departments. And, but also looking around and hearing what people are saying, what other news is reporting, what somebody said on Facebook. I mean, the weird thing about being a professional news reporter is that while gossip and rumor are kind of the enemy, you also have to listen to them to check them out and see if they're true. So living in a small town, you kind of have to listen and put yourself in a position to hear what people are saying and then check it out and report on what's true and report on what's not true. Well, not necessarily, but report on what's true at least. And if people are saying things that are not true, then clearing that up. So the process, it's not a set process, but our reporters have beats, areas that they cover primarily. I'm the editor, I'm the managing editor is my title. And so I'm not so much a reporter. They're usually the main ones finding stories, but I'll find them too, from everything from reading. Every day I read a whole lot of news media. I read what other people are reporting. I read as much as I can. And I'll pass story ideas on to the reporters. I'm usually the one in the office. So when people call or email with news tips, I'm the one who distributes that, and I'll sort through it. And if something seems like it might be news, I'll send it off to a reporter. And the reporters will then chase it down, check it out, find out what's happening, and report. We want to get it right. We want to get it quickly while it's still newsworthy. And it's not a real set process exactly, so much as find news and report it. Find news, verify it, tell people something they don't know that's true. It's the job, because people are curious and we're but they can't find everything out on their own. They don't have enough time to do that. And so we're kind of the agents of their curiosity. They hire us, so to speak, to tell them what's going on. So the next question is, how do you verify it? to ensure that information is accurate? Well, the number one thing we usually do is talk to the people involved, and talk to more than one person. And if you can talk, once you get into the habit of doing this, there's an instinct, there's a sense of when you need to find out more, but still it also involves editing. So a reporter will come to me and I'll say, okay, that guy told you that, but do you know if he's right? And they'll say, oh, well, actually, I didn't double check that, so I will. So it's, how do we verify it? By committing every day to trying to verify it. Stuff still slips by. I mean, it's not a perfect process, but professional journalists correct mistakes. And there are a whole bunch of other people out there who don't. So if we make a mistake, we fix it, and we fix it online as well. So it's very important to not just run a correction in the next day's print edition. It's very important to correct the online version, because that's what people are going to find forever, perhaps, on the internet. So how do we verify it? Talk to people, find online sources. It's sometimes easier now than it used to be. Know where things are, know where to find certain bits of information. Know that if you want to find out this kind of information, you need to go to these types of websites or sources or archives. Have people keep people's phone numbers so you can get a hold of them when you need to track them down and verify something. How do you handle personal or cultural bias? First of all, by being honest about it with each other and knowing where each other stand. But the number one thing is, how do you handle it? You set it aside largely. I mean, everybody is biased. You can't help but be shaped by your background or opinions, but you also can make, it's a choice on, are you going to be professional, and are you going to do the job? Because you're working for a whole bunch of people. You're not just working for one very tailored political audience. You have to respond to everybody. If at least if you're working for most media, you have it's mass media. You have a wide audience, and you have to give something that will be acceptable to all of them. So you have to set aside your biases for the most part. Sometimes you will know something based on your background that you'll be able to check. You'll be more attuned to when somebody's doing something that's not quite right. That can help you, but still, there's no reason not to be honest about things, but there's also, you have a job to do. What media sources besides your own do you trust, and why, is the next question. I think if you choose to be a professional news reporter, you're doing all these things I mentioned. You're verifying things, you're checking things out, you're correcting your mistakes, you're setting aside your biases. So I think generally professional news media, I generally trust. Now, trust is never 100%. I mean, the people I trust the most, I don't trust to be right about everything. And so you still double check it. You still say, well, how do we know that they have it right? But over time, I also think that they're in the same situation I am, that they're probably not wanting to present something to a mass audience without double checking. So still, you know, the old trust but verify thing, I guess you have to do that to a large degree. I generally trust professional news media, opinion news media, not so much, as a rule. But you know, you always have some skepticism there, and that's important because that drives you to double check more. The next question is, how do you even know what merits checking? What are clues that something might be false? Not giving sources. I do this every day with letters to the editor, every single day, because we get a lot of letters to the editor. And there's the old statement, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And so I'm fact checking letters every day, and my reporters' news articles as well. So you have to go in skeptical. You have to, if somebody gives a lot of, I read a lot of news, and if somebody's throwing out something about recent current events that I haven't, that's new to me, I'll ask them about it. I'll ask them for a source. If they don't have one, if they can't produce one, that is a red flag. I think you have to ask a lot of questions politely, not assuming that somebody's wrong, but just asking, and then see what happens. But what merits checking? Some clues. It's try to think like the person. I think like my reporters when I edit their stories. How might they have slipped up? What if I'm thinking like they are? I know how I slip up. I know the kinds of things where I forget to double check something. So I try to think like them, and think, okay, if he or she was doing this, did they double check that? And so I asked them. I think trying to, as much as you can, to think like the writer helps. But sometimes you don't know them. So you get better over time. You get more skeptical over time. You get burned on things. I've been editor here for 16 and a half years, and I've accidentally let a whole lot of stuff by. And I remember.
Well, Peter, none of us expect you to be perfect. So thank you for your honest responses to those questions. Andy, you're up next.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, North Country Community College. Good job, Peter. I work with Peter Crowley. We're sister newspapers. He's the daily, we're the weekly at the Lake Placid News. And, I concur with everything he said, but I've got a few examples that I'd like to share with you as well. As far as, what is your process for gathering and disseminating news and information to your audience? And how do you verify it to ensure the information is accurate? That's the first question. Gathering, get story ideas. There are many places we get story ideas from our own ideas to press releases to social media, news tips, pitches from reporters, pitches from the public, government meetings, all over the place. Find out if it's newsworthy enough, if it's timely, if it affects a lot of people. We get it in the newspaper, get it online. But it really comes down to research. I find that not just research for the stories, but before I interview people, I would try to do, if I have enough time, enough research so I can ask them questions that are relevant, that are timely, but also in case they try to slip one by me and I can call them on it, say, well, what about this? And that research comes in pretty handy. But I read a lot of history stories, so I do a lot of research with New York State Historic Newspapers website. But I find that when a newspaper gets it wrong the first time, maybe they correct it for the following issue. you don't see it during that issue. So if you take something verbatim from that story, it may or may not be true, especially when it comes to dates and spellings of names and those sorts of things. So I'm very careful when I go back in time and look at our archives for our newspaper, for other newspapers when I do stories. I try to cross-reference things and make sure that, especially spellings of names, I don't want to have to make a correction. Obviously, one story I actually made it into a story was actually a correction. The World War I monument in Lake Placid at the Adirondack Community Church has a list of 8 names of service men who served in the armed forces during World War I. And I was doing some research and actually found out there's one name missing on that. So if I actually, said there are 8 people who from Lake Placid who served in the military during World War I, it would be inaccurate. And I tried to set the record straight with that particular story because I have tools, I can cross-reference on ancestry.com, which I did a lot, the Find a Grave, when I have to cross-reference names and stuff like that. I wrote a story about the history book on the Adirondack Community Church that recently came out. And it was co-written by the local historian. So I figured everything in there was accurate. And there was the spelling of the businessman who, before they built the stone church, they had to move the wooden church. So the businessman who bought the wooden church moved it. I don't know if you're familiar with Lake Placid. That's the Adirondack Community Church near the post office. They moved the wooden church down to where, on School Street, the building where Wise Guys is. That was the old church there. Anyway, the name was Dura Jenny, but it was spelled wrong. I actually found that out because I was looking up his name in the historic newspaper's website, and I found a discrepancy. And that's, so I had to double check and triple check. And unfortunately, I had to call the historian and say, that this name is not spelled correctly. I cross-referenced and found his name in an obituary, which I figure is going to be pretty accurate. Hopefully, your name, your name is spelled correctly in your obit. But those are just little things. But in the long run, if you're not doing any of that, it really erodes your credibility and your product and your integrity. When I taught journalism, even some young journalists, they would use Wikipedia as a source, which I cringe at. Don't use that as a source. Use it at maybe a starting point before you do research. It's always best to go to primary sources, documents, people, even, people's recollections are fuzzy. Sometimes reports, official websites. One village trustee in Lake Placid, it wasn't his fault at all. He said at a public meeting that there was the cases of frozen pipes in Lake Placid were up this winter, which we thought that's a story. He even pitched the idea to do an explainer. It was a village trustee, and he said, well, tell people how they can keep, from having their pipes frozen. And so we double checked. We wanted to see, well, what are the numbers? Well, we found out after calling the Department of Public Works that it wasn't true, but we did find out that, some of the second homeowners weren't hiring caretakers anymore. And so they weren't watching over the house to make sure that the pipes didn't freeze. The water wasn't on when it was really, really cold out. And so when they came to Lake Placid to visit, they found frozen pipes. So there are more of those, but overall, there wasn't a big story there. So we just had to double check. Don't trust, just because it's a village trustee, don't trust what they have to say. It wasn't malicious. It was just, it was just something he said, but, verify, make sure that you cross-reference, make sure it's true, that particular one wasn't. So, try to fact checked. We don't have any staff people to do fact checking. Larger organizations do. They'll take a story and they'll make some phone calls. Did you say this? That sort of thing. We don't have that. it requires a lot of self-editing, editing on our parts as editors, but it's self-editing for people who are writing the stories. And I say question everything, even if you wrote it. You know, is that the correct spelling? Is that the correct title? Is that the, that sort of thing. Time is a factor. You can't check every single thing, but I have to go back. If I'm writing on deadline, it's the worst time to do it, because something's right and you still wrote it wrong, and you don't find out until after it's over, and then you have to correct it. Next question is, how do you handle personal and cultural bias? Obviously, I try to separate myself from my stories as much as possible, be as objective as much as possible. When I was on Facebook, I'm no longer on Facebook in a public way. I rarely posted comments with my own opinion on political things or anything like that. I just tried to keep that separate, keep my opinions to myself. What media sources besides your own do you trust, and why? Obviously national newspapers like the Washington Post and New York Times, magazines like the New Yorker. But I'm really a public radio person at heart. North Country Public Radio, National Public Radio. I know I'm a correspondent for North Country Public Radio, but still I've always trusted them. Pat Bradley at WAMC, Karen DeWitt out of Albany. I trust them. I know them. And I know how professional they are. They're regional newspapers, in Glens Falls, Watertown, Plattsburgh. I know these people and I know their integrity. TV news, again, public television, PBS NewsHour, the big networks. But, like Peter said, when you cross the opinion with news, even on CNN, when it's not necessarily an opinion show, they cross the line a lot. And I don't want to bash CNN, but I cringe every time I see that, and I just turn it off. And when they're supposed to be a newscaster and they throw in their opinion, I don't like that when they do it within the same breath a lot of times. How do you even know what merits checking? What are the clues that something might be false when someone insists that something is the truth? Well, I'm of the opinion that everything merits checking. Like I said, even if you wrote it, there's malicious intent, and then there's, just an accident. There's, I made a mistake. We don't see a lot of those malicious things around here. I don't see that often. If there's something in the media, locally or regionally, I think it's just an honest mistake. I truthfully believe that. If someone claims something is true, you may not think it's true. Maybe their motives for steering you in the right direction. Maybe they have personal biases, or they have an agenda. And usually we know, we can sniff that out, or we know by their title or what they're trying to do. It happens a lot with politicians, I have to say. I'll leave with one example here. This I did today. I noticed that on the Essex County Health Department website, when it talks about vaccinations for people with comorbidities, underlying health conditions like heart disease and cancer and diabetes, they say they have vaccines available for people 18 years of age and older. Well, New York State says 16 years of age and older. Now, if I actually printed 16, if I changed that, I'm writing a story about the vaccination clinic in Lake Placid last week. If I actually changed that from 18 to 16, like what the state says, I would have been wrong, because I actually checked that out today. I called, emailed the Essex County Public Health, and they said with the Moderna vaccine, it's 18 years of age and older. If they did Pfizer, that's 16. So they're both right. 16 is right and 18 is right. So, but don't just go by what you're reading, double check and verify. Again, it all comes down to integrity, being objective, fixing mistakes, making those corrections on a regular basis and very timely. And that's what I have, and I will hand it off to the next person. Thanks, Mary.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andy. And that example about the vaccine is very timely and understandable, actually. All that vaccination stuff can be quite confusing. So up next we have Brandon Loomis. Brandon from the Adirondack Explorer.
Hello, everybody. For those who don't know the Explorer, we're a magazine and website that covers the Adirondack Park as a whole, with particular interest in environmental policy, land management, outdoor recreation, and to some extent, community economics, rural economics, the things that it takes to make a life here or otherwise enjoy the park. So I'm the editor, and I'll address, I guess, the first two questions at the same time, what our process is for news gathering and how we verify that information is accurate. And it'll sound familiar. I come from a background of newspapers before I was here, and everything that's been said before makes sense to me and is sort of second nature to a lot of us who are in the business. The thing I would add that I think is maybe important to consider throughout this discussion when it comes to our credibility, news outlets' credibility, is the necessity of showing your work, as they might say in school. It's important to not just tell people what you've determined is true or as reasonably well as you can determine it to be true. It's also important to show how you arrived at that, who you relied on, where the information came from, which sounds simple enough, but it's not always. And that maybe that gets to the question too of how what outlets you trust. If they don't show any of that, you might have a problem, or you might at least want to investigate further. But we in news gathering, we have different tiers of stories, I guess I'd say, in terms of how you go about gathering the information and how much time it takes. But probably the simplest one to explain is a quick story that you might do. You've either heard something or you've been given information from an official source or a tip, but you pick up the phone and you make a phone call. You make a few phone calls, we hope, so that you have more than one voice, and you verify the information, or you have a news release or some other official document that comes from a source that you trust, basically. And so you're gonna put it out as truth, or as a news story that you can then say, this is where we got it. This person, and so you feel you have a relationship with that source. You believe that they're honest with you. You feel good about that, and that's probably the simplest form of news story that you can put out. Another is, you might hear of something and then decide that you want to go to the place that it's happening, or to the person who's involved. An example of that in our latest magazine that I participated in would be, we heard that there was a new, or actually a reopened ski trail, cross-country ski trail in the southern part of the park. And so, I could have handled it the way I just described. I could have picked up the phone, talked to them, done that. But of course I wanted to go skiing. So I did, but I didn't want to just go ski and write about my experience. I wanted to talk about what it took to reopen this. People had to get involved and cut some downed timber that was in the way, clear some brush, build a bridge. There was a lot of volunteer work involved. So it was kind of a cool community story. And so I called the people who had done this and asked them if I could come skiing with them. And I did that. And as often happens when you do something like that, they say, well, who else was involved? And also somebody from the state agency was involved in approving these things and in getting us some, they had to be approved as volunteers to do state work and so on, to build the bridge. And so basically what happens is I show up at the trailhead and all these people are there and my story's right in front of me. And they were all obviously very, very much involved in the story and so trustworthy. So that's, I guess, the next step up. Another way that it happens is that, as has been mentioned already, you might follow government proceedings. In our case, we have a reporter who covers the Adirondack Park Agency that meets periodically, and you might just go to that meeting, and the easiest thing that happens there is that they debate something, they take a vote, and you write that story. And certainly that happens. Sometimes it's the biggest news you have of the day, but a lot of times what happens is there's some discussion that happens around that issue or around some other issue that's seems to be trending, and you start to hear that somebody in some other community is doing this, and it just kind of builds on itself if you pay attention, and then you can go find the people outside of that meeting who are affected. Sometimes it's, to use the Adirondack Park Agency, there might be some kind of enforcement action against somebody who's done something that's not allowed under some zoning situation in the park, and they might be facing a fine. Well, there are people involved in that, and you can talk to them. They might not be there, but you can reach out to them. You can even go visit them, see what they're talking about, what their side of that story is. And meantime, the agency is going to have documents that will show you what they've been up to, how they've pursued it. And this is this turns into a story perhaps that you might sort of have a classic, both sides of an issue that you're addressing, but because you don't know for sure what's happened all the way along the line, it's important to give both sides their say in something like that. And then ultimately, I think what we do that requires the most time is the kind of reporting where you might put in a request to a state agency for some documents where you've learned of something that you think is worth writing about. You need to have the evidence that what you think is true is true. So you ask for these documents, which are available to anyone. You don't have to be a journalist to ask for them. It's sometimes a chore to get them. The people who are in charge of them might not be eager to share them, or they might be busy doing other things. It can take months sometimes, and because we have journalists who it's their job to do this, you can have the patience to do it. I realize not everyone is going to spend the time doing that, but you can, and you can appeal it if you don't get them. Anyway, ultimately what happens is you get documents in hand and you've learned, either you've confirmed what you thought, or you've learned something else that's equally interesting or more interesting. And now you're armed with some information that probably tells you who's involved, and you can pursue it. The other thing you can do, I'll give an example. We've invested in coverage of an issue in the Adirondacks, which people have been talking about for years and writing about, but it's about the road salt problem in the winters. There's a lot of road salt that's put on the roads to clear them, make them safer, and it runs off, ends up in the groundwater, and it can affect the ecology here. But we've focused a lot lately on the effects to people's wells and their health. And so we have a reporter who did some of this, searching for documents, which has taken better part of a year to get some of them. And in the meantime, he worked with advocates who are interested in this, with lawyers who have either filed lawsuits or considered filing lawsuits. He basically talked around to find out who's pursuing these things. And then he went and searched every court in New York that he could to find where these suits may have been filed, if they were, from people who felt that they were harmed by road salt. The next step after that was to talk to the people who filed them. You know, there would be people who, there was one family who had a farm who had a bunch of cows die. And there was a state official who acknowledged, we've dumped a lot of salt there. It's reasonable to expect that this salt ended up on your farm. And there was a lawsuit where they made their case, but they lost, I believe, on a technicality such as, you know, there are very strict filing requirements. Maybe they didn't file it in time. I'm not remembering that particular case, whether that's what happened, but something like that kept them from getting anywhere. But my point is that we didn't just write a story that said these people claim that, you know, they've been hurt by salt. We had a court filing that included testing of their water, which verified that it was very high. We had experts then saying, that's, you know, I can't tell you that this killed your cows, but it's not good. It's not good for cows. And there was also some evidence that the state was acknowledging that they could have been the source of the salt. And the same thing played out with people who have health issues elsewhere in the park, who likewise had tests of their wells, and it turned out that their salt was really high. We couldn't make the case. We couldn't 100% say this person's health issues were linked to that salt, but there was a lot of evidence stacked up that suggested to the reader that a reasonable person might believe that that there's a connection there. On the question of personal bias, I concur with everything that's been said about, you know, trying to set aside. It's difficult sometimes, but it's also our job. So we take it seriously, not to try to bias something. It's inherent in human nature, I suppose, that you have to, you're not always aware of your own bias, perhaps. And so to address that point, to the extent possible, I think the best way around that is just to involve as many sources as you can, to talk to as many people, to spend time in their home if you can, if you have that luxury of time. Because obviously people not everyone lives, thinks, speaks, is the way that I am. And the more time I can spend with them and just sort of absorb their viewpoint, perhaps the better job I can do of representing them in the story. And again, the other thing is just back to the presenting both sides. I mean, it's sort of, journalists have caught a lot of criticism in recent years for being too committed to this idea of presenting two sides of every story, where maybe it's kind of consensus that one side is right, you know, that there's truth and then there's somebody who's denying truth. But if it's not that, in that case, the simplest way of dealing with bias is just to let people have their say. And to the question of, the media sources that I trust, all the sources on here I trust on this panel, and I mean that and any of the sources like them. It's like I started off saying, the important thing is to show your work, to show, you know, if I do a story that's based on a news release or on an interview over the phone, I may not say it exactly in those words, but I'm going to say it in some way so that the reader knows this is how they got this information. And I think that's why you so often, if you're not familiar with news writing, if you you'll often see somebody say, a reporter say, that somebody said something in a statement, which is basically just saying that that it was sent to them. You know, there's but my point is that any news organization that shows you where their information came from and how they know it to the best of their ability, that's what's trustworthy. And then to the question of how do you know when something is perhaps kind of fishy or could be false? A lot of us, I'm afraid, treat this as just sort of second nature, like, well, I know it when I see it, and that's the truth of, you know, we it's just if there's a red flag and I don't know how to explain what the red flag is, then I go after it. But because I'm aware that that's kind of how I treat it, I kind of cheated on this one, and when I prepared for this, and I called an old boss of mine who, after we worked together at a newspaper, he went on to be, he worked in the news literacy program at Stony Brook University. And then these days he's working as a, I guess you'd call him a fact checker or a debunker. He works with an organization that basically if something goes viral on Facebook, they look into it, and then Facebook can know whether it's something that they should flag. And you know, the things that he talked about were like, right now we're talking about vaccinations. You know, there are a lot of wild theories about the coronavirus and about vaccines, and basically his main point was, if the evidence isn't like I was saying, showing your work, if they're not showing their work, if there's self-serving language without some kind of serious evidence presented, for instance, in that case, it might be something from a scientific journal. You might see somebody make an outlandish claim and then link to something that goes somewhere but isn't a real scientific journal. You can tell pretty easily, if you get used to it, looking at it, there's no peer review on it. There co-authors and editor. It's just not there. It's just like they're pretending that there's something there. So you need to look for that sort of evidence. And his advice, my former boss's advice, was to follow the advice of Carl Sagan, who said, extraordinary, what is it? Extraordinary claims, I think. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. So I guess the more outlandish something is, maybe the more you need to support it before you're going to pass it along. Hope I've answered the questions.
Yes, Brandon, you did. And thank you for speaking a little bit about the Freedom of Information law in New York State. That is something that's important for people to know. We just finished celebrating Sunshine Week, which is a week dedicated to heightening awareness about Freedom of Information law and open meetings law, and how government should be transparent and responsive to the people. So, and that's all people, not just journalists. Emily Russell, you've waited a long time, but you are up next.
I want to point out that during this panel discussion, my mother texted me with 2 corrections to my story that aired today. 2 little typos, not anything factual, just little typos in my story. So get yourself a good mother and, you know, family that's going to call you on your errors. And I'm going to keep my answers short because I really want to hear from the students. And a lot of what everybody else has said so far rings true for me. It's interesting to hear, because I think we all do something a little bit different. We're all obviously reporters, but we file very differently. I work in radio. The fact checking isn't different, but the way I report is a little bit different. The way I get my information out in the world is different. But in terms of fact checking and getting sources you trust is all the same. And I'm going to kind of go out of order, but I do want to kind of start by echoing Brandon and everybody else, saying the people on this call are the journalists I trust. I check the Enterprise every day. I check the Explorer every day. I'm on the Press Republican and the Lake Placid News, and just like, that's kind of where I stay up to date with what's going on, in my communities, but also where I get story ideas and, source ideas. And I've seen somewhere that, people are distrustful of the media, but the media that they trust the most is their local journalists. And I think there's a reason for that. It's because in part, we're in your communities, we're your neighbors, we're your friends, we're your, family. And I think there's real power to that. So yeah, I consume a lot of local news, which is really wonderful. We've got such a strong community of journalists in the North Country and the Adirondacks. And then NPR I find pretty wonderful, national papers, but mostly I'm consuming local news. And it's interesting, Mary, you talked about in the beginning about social media. I kind of grew up on social media, not maybe the way the students here did, but kind of on the fringe of it. And it's a really kind of, it's like Andy mentioned, like Wikipedia, you don't want to kind of get, just kind of trust everything you see on social media. But I've found as a journalist, it's kind of a treasure trove of sources and, people that you just might not run into in the grocery store or might not know personally, but you're going to find incredible story ideas on social media. And you're also going to kind of figure out what people care about and what they're talking about. So I've really kind of leaned on that a lot, and our newsroom has as well. And I think it's also a really powerful way to disseminate the news that we have. I really lean heavily on Facebook, because I know a lot of our listeners and readers are on Facebook, and then Twitter is a kind of a different world. I've been using Instagram more to share our news and share important information about vaccine clinics. You kind of never know who's going to be on these different outlets. We are not on TikTok, we're not on Snapchat or anything like that, but I do what I can, and I think it's a really useful tool for finding news stories and also kind of getting them out in the world. And then it's obviously, the consumer's responsibility to, make sure that it's coming from, factual news source. Okay, I'm going to kind of cherry pick these. One thing the question about handling personal bias and cultural bias is a really tough question. And it's been, I think happily people are talking about it more, and it's, people are more aware of, that everybody, is biased in a way. And so it's been really nice to be kind of like forced to be more aware of that and figure out ways to, one thing that we've done in our newsroom, we're now keeping track just internally of, the sources that we're using and who we're putting on the radio and who's, what experts we're relying on. Because often if you're just calling the same, 6 experts and the same 6 politicians, a lot of the times those people are going to be white, and a lot of the times those people are going to be men. And so we've really, really tried to be much more thoughtful about that, trying, it's a constant progress to, check yourself every time you're looking for a new source on a story or just a new story idea. We really trying to figure out how we can diversify the voices and sources we're getting on the radio and online, because, the people that are answering your questions, they might have the same facts, but they perceive those facts differently, and their lived experience is different. So that's something that's really important. Okay. Is there anything I like I said, I kind of want to hear from the students, so I don't want to take up too much time, but if there's anything I'm missing, you can call me on it and I'll address it. But other than that.
Emily, I think you've covered everything that really needed to be covered. I thank you for focusing a little bit differently on bias and how your newsroom does try to diversify voice. I know that's a challenge, especially if your community isn't exceedingly diverse. It's even more so, but even making the attempt is worth the exercise, because people do come at the world through different lenses, just from their personal life experiences. So, and speaking about different lenses and personal life experiences, Astrid, I think I would like you to go first and speak to the student panelist questions.
All right. First of all, I would just like to say that all of the professional panelists did a great job, and it was awesome hearing from all of you. So to jump right into the student panelist questions, the first one is, where do you get your news and information? I'm a little embarrassed to say most of the time I get it from social media, mainly Twitter and Instagram. I fluctuate between having legitimate news source apps on my phone and not, simply because the constant influx of like legitimate news all the time, it can be a little stressful, especially in 2020 and 2021 with the pandemic and the election. So sometimes I just have to delete it. But when I do have the apps, it's often BBC News and NPR. And I really like those sources because I find that, BBC isn't like an American news source. It's British broadcasting channel, I think. And so it's kind of like an outsider's perspective on America, which I really like. And then NPR is NPR. I think NPR is good.
Can I say something? Just 1 second. I was thinking about this in this panel. One cool thing, I don't know why I haven't thought about this before, but one cool thing about NPR is, we have national reporters that are NPR reporters, but NPR is made up of like me, I don't work for NPR, but it's local journalists all across the country. So often the news, Astrid, that you're consuming is from people like me who live in these communities and, are local journalists. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So that's mainly where I get my news and information, but most of the time it's just Instagram and Twitter, because as a teenager, I must admit, I spend quite a lot of time on those apps. And then the second question is, do you verify the information you see or hear as accurate? If so, how? I try to verify it, especially if it is a story that interests me. If it's on a topic that I'm passionate about, I see it on Twitter or Instagram, I will look it up and find reputable sources and read about it. But if it's just like a story that I'm kind of like about, and I see it on Twitter, I'm like, okay, that's the news. And I won't do any further research. And then the third question is, what media sources do I trust and why? And I kind of already went over that, BBC and NPR. And then of course the local news. I really like reading the local newspaper, especially when it has to do with, like, if there's a story about my school or like a protest I was part of. I think it's really cool seeing the stuff that I'm a part of in the newspaper. So I also read the local news, like the Lake Placid news and everything. So, and then what kind of stories do I comment on and or share with friends? What triggers you to do that? A lot of the time, the stories that I comment on or share with my friends are, again, stories that I'm like passionate about, like certain topics like climate change or things that have to do with the education system or the pandemic, because those are all things that I have experience with and that I have interest in. So if it's an interesting story about one of those topics, I will comment on it or I will share it with my friends, because I think they're important topics and I think people should be reading about them and learning about them. And then the final question is, if I were to be given facts that something I believe is wrong, would I be willing to change my opinion? And yes, absolutely. I'm always willing to, learn and grow and change. Right now, my opinions are that of a 16-year-old girl, and I know that they're subject to change because they're just based off of the few years of experience that I have. So if someone gives me facts and says, hey, what you're saying is incorrect, I will probably thank them for letting me know, and then I will probably try to do some more research on what it is that they told me I was incorrect about. So I hope I answered all of the questions in a good way. Thank you.
Are you a student at Lake Placid?
Yes, I'm a junior at Lake Placid.
Cool.
Astrid, thank you very much for your time and energy. And there is no wrong answer when it's your opinion. So what you do is what we wanted to hear about. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Reuben, are you ready to go next?
Sure. I'm Reuben Bernstein from Saranac Lake High School. I'm a senior. Similar to Astrid, I mean, I'm a teenager, so I'm on social media a lot. And a lot of the time I see something on Instagram or Snapchat or something, or I hear something from my friends. And if it's an outlandish story or something, I think this was mentioned before, but the proven best source for information is our moms. A lot of the time I will go straight to my mom, and I know she reads the paper and listens to NPR. So she could be indoctrinating me and I would have no idea, but I trust her as a source. I also watch a lot of late night comedy, and I know it's not the best source, but I generally trust like The Daily Show or SNL. And I know like some people will laugh at that, but generally their information is pretty accurate. So I've found, at least. If I see something though on Instagram, similar to what Astrid said, I'll generally, if it's something I don't really care about, just kind of skip by it. But if I do think I like it, then I'll generally look on like New York Times or something that I really trust. And I think that brings me to what do I trust? And like I said, most of the local papers and local reporters, I mean, I have found absolutely no reason not to trust them. And New York Times is obviously one of the places that I go for. I've also found that we've done a lot of research in school about basically how to find reputable sources on Google and stuff. And so that helps a lot when I'm looking up stuff. Another big thing is our teachers. In some of our classes, we're talking a lot about current events and stuff. And I know like my social studies teacher, he just drops like random facts just because he knows so much about them. And then some of my teachers I'm just conversing with, and they'll just drop stuff about current events and stuff. And once again, I can't just take them for granted, but I know generally that they're pretty highly educated people and that I can usually trust them. I think I pretty much answered a couple of the first questions. I think what news do I generally share? It's probably not the best way, but if I can fit it into a joke, I usually share it. And then similar to Astrid, if I find it interesting, I'll usually share it with my friends. But a lot of the time it's my friends sharing it with me. And then if they shared it with me, then I'm probably more likely to share it with someone else because it's just that kind of news. Also, if it's something super outlandish, I will always share that. Just fun facts. Will my opinion change? I would say that I generally assume that I'm wrong. So if I hear something, I will pretty much always believe that the other person is right, unless I've actually researched that, or I heard it from my mom, of course. And I pretty much, I always trust like my teachers and stuff. So a lot of the time I'll like hear something on social media and then check with somebody I trust. That's all I got. Thank you.
I'm going to add Reuben. I'm going to add Reuben's mom to the news sources I trust as well.
Is she on this call?
I don't know. She might be.
She is in the other room laughing at me.
But I trust you too, Nancy.
I will tell you as a mom, I'm loving every answer that you gave, especially trusting your mom as a source. I wish my children equally trusted me as a source. I would say that I'm not quite as successful as your mother is in you getting her getting you to trust her, though. Okay, we still have Libby. So Libby, if you would address those same questions, I'd appreciate it. And then we can take questions from our attendees.
All right, so I'm Libby Gillis. I'm a junior at Tupper Lake High School. And you're going to be really shocked by the answer I'm about to give, but my main source of where I get my news and information is also social media. So I will similarly to Astrid and Reuben, if I come upon an article or a topic that I am interested in, I will look more into it, and I'll try to make sure that they have reputable sources, or I can look it up on a different news website that I trust more so than someone on social media. So yeah, I look into the things that I'm more interested in. I do pay attention to the local news. Both of my parents are avid readers of the local newspapers. So much like Reuben, I do go to my parents to verify some things that I hear. And yeah, I listen a lot to what they have to say. And it's always good to just know what's going on in the community. And the last way that I get most of my news is also through school, my teachers, usually like my social studies classes. We will, especially with the previous election that just happened and stuff like that, we will spend a few days talking about like that whole process and what's going on currently. And also just sometimes within the lesson, my history teacher will relate something that we're learning about to something that's currently happening in the media. So that's always a good way to like learn, sort of further understand like what's happening right now. And so do I verify this information? And if so, how? I usually try to verify if I'm on social media and I'm gonna actually believe something, then I will try to go verify it, see if that person has listed any like reputable sources, or go check on a different source. One thing that I found very helpful is that one of my social studies teachers, she actually a while back gave us a chart of like rankings of the most viable news sources based on how much like bias they have or stuff like that. So I usually will go to the top of that chart and look up the story I'm looking for on one of those sources that seem to be the most trustworthy. And what kind of stories do I comment on or share with my friends? Lately with the pandemic, that's always a big one. We're constantly talking about it. We're in like a weird school pattern. It's on all of our minds a lot of the time. So I do find myself, whether it's joking or just day-to-day conversation, I do find that like in school, we talk about that a lot. And also previously with the election, again, whether we're just joking around or just having small conversations, I feel like my peers and I are finally at the age where we're starting to like understand politics and get more interested in it. So I feel like we have talked about that this year more than we ever have with each other. And also just any current like big news in the media or social injustices or anything that we feel like passionate about, I will discuss that with my friends, see what they think about it, see if they know more about it, anything like that. And the last question is, if I were given facts to something I believe is wrong, am I willing to change my opinion? And my answer is also yes, because obviously I'm a 16-year-old. I'm not going to go around thinking that everything I know is the truth. And if I'm talking to someone that I trust, or just mostly any adult in my life, I will believe them if they tell me that something I'm saying is wrong or they have facts to back it up. And yeah, I think that's about all the questions.
Okay, thank you, Libby. We are now going to open this up to questions from our attendees. There was one question that had come in earlier that was, what is a news desert? How big a problem is it? And is it a problem in our area? And I have a few slides that I will speak to news deserts in a few minutes, but I wanna make sure that we answer other questions. So Sarah Kilby wrote, my question is, how do you decide what needs to be released as breaking news? And how do you keep something that is changing quickly accurate? I found that things like the recent shooting or weather incidences, that the information is more accurate at least a few hours after it's happened over the immediate information. How do you balance the business needs of running a media organization with providing the accuracy of the information? It's an excellent question because breaking news has that inherent issue. Do any of our professional journalists want to answer? Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, as the editor of a daily paper, I might be in the most position to deal with this. It's hard. First of all, for local news stories, what stories do we decide to do as breaking news? We're not going to do the story. It depends. Sometimes we err on the side of, well, we just want to get this news out there so we have something fresh on our website, and the way to do that is it gets labeled as breaking news, and then we kind of, I look at it afterwards and I think, well, I don't want to have a 4-alarm fire about that, but at the same time, but on the other hand, on national news, it has to be pretty big for us, state and national news, for us to put that on our local newspaper on the homepage as breaking news. And then there's a responsibility to keep it updated kind of all day long until you go to bed. And that's hard. If it's story we're reporting, obviously usually the whole news team is in on that. If it's a story we're getting from the Associated Press, then it's just a question of keeping up with the updates. And that's a responsibility that we take pretty seriously. I mean, I feel like when you go to bed for the night, people will give you a pass until the morning, and then they'll want to start hearing the latest. Because then in the morning you might be outdated. So once you decide to start going live, breaking news with a national or state story, it has to be big enough to make the commitment to it.
Yeah. And it has to be something that's a strong enough story that has that interest that you're going to put that energy into too. Right. So it's a combination of those things. It's those drivers. What drives that? The next question is from Janice Schachter, and it's to our student panelists. She is wondering if the students think their less savvy friends know that social media is not a news organization. Do most teenagers pay attention to the origins of what they're seeing on social media? Do most look elsewhere to verify what interests them? All three of you had said that you verify the information somewhere else if it's important to you. Which, by the way, doesn't make you different from your adult peers, because if it doesn't interest us, we just kind of fluff it off too. If it's of no interest, we don't really pay much attention to it at all. But if it is interesting to us, we will verify it. So that's sort of normal behavior. That's not indicative of just you. I think all humans do that to some degree. But do you think most of your peers verify information that they see on social media? So any one of you want to chime in there?
I would like to hope that most of my peers fact check their information. I know there are a handful of students who don't, and having conversations with them can sometimes be frustrating because they do not check their sources and they don't verify that the information they have is correct. But for the most part, many of my peers will fact check to some extent if they have any interest in this story.
Okay, Libby, do you have anything more to add?
I do agree with what Astrid just said. I sometimes do notice that it seems like some of my peers will be posting about or talking about information that may be more opinionated and not always checking facts, but I do think a lot of people try to at least look at the sources they're looking at, see if they're viable, and hopefully just do some form of fact checking, but sometimes you can kind of tell that that doesn't occur.
And do you try to point out that perhaps they should fact check, or do you throw your hands up and say, oh, it doesn't matter if I try to correct this person, it's just going to be not even worth my time.
Yeah, sometimes I do try to like just hint at the fact that or maybe just like by asking them what their source was from their comment, it'll get them thinking about like, oh, like maybe I should have like double checked that or something like that. But sometimes if it's gonna be like too much trouble, I won't bring it up. But a lot of the times I just like to ask like where they heard it from in a polite way just to see if they have actually checked that.
Fair enough. Reuben, anything to add?
Sure. I think most of my friends basically see something on Instagram and then they usually just do a quick Google search. I don't know if they necessarily look at like where the information on Google is coming from, but it's just like the box that comes up, they probably trust. And it's like difficult having conversations with people who don't fact check at least some of their information, of course. But I think generally if you call them on it and they can't really refute you, then generally they're willing to go back and research it a little bit more.
Okay, well, I'm glad that you're having those kinds of conversations in your high school. I have been out of high school for a tremendously long time. So social media wasn't even the twinkle of anybody's eye back in the Stone Ages when I was in school. So it's a whole new world than where I was back in the day. Are there any other questions from our attendees?
I have
Okay.
a question.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm curious why like our three students on here, do you guys have like student newspapers? How did you get involved in this conversation?
So I think, what is it, Cedar Young, she's a senior at Saranac Lake. She asked me to be a part of it mainly because they needed someone from like Placid, and I kind of have a reputation in the area for being good at public speaking, and that was the reason Cedar gave me. She was like, you can speak in front of people. Do you want to do this? I was like, sure.
Nice.
Yes, I was also reached by Cedar Young. She actually runs a political activism club. Which is another source of news that I get my news from. News. And yeah, she reached out to me.
Yeah, that was the I'm sure Libby's going to tell you the same thing. Yeah. Yeah. Cedar was the connection for these three particular students to be a part of our panel tonight. Do any of you students have a question for any of the professional panelists? Okay, hearing nothing, we have another question. This one is for Brandon Loomis. You talked about the importance of showing your work. Do the journalists think there is a lack of transparency, of this type of transparency today?
Well, I don't know if I'd say there's a lack of transparency. I do think it's shifting a bit. You know, I can't remember using an unnamed source in the Explorer. We might have since I've been here, but the bar would be pretty high before I would approve that. But I think the media landscape as a whole, including media sources that I really trust, have gone more to that than they used to, more than I was used to when I was young. It was like there's got to be a really pressing reason to allow someone to speak without their name behind it. So does that mean they're not trustworthy? I think it would help if they used names, and it would help if they used names more often, or I should say didn't use unnamed sources as often as they do. But that becomes it makes things trickier. You know, it depends on a relationship between the reader and the media outlet. You have to, if you're going to put information out without somebody's name attached to it, you're assuming that the people who are reading it know you well enough to trust you. And I think you have to have established that there's reason for that. And I think it's difficult because so many people, we've just heard, I mean, most people are getting their news from social media now. So even though we may be the source of it, they may not be coming to it through our magazine, through our newspaper, through our website.
Right.
You may just be stumbling on it, and they might look at it and say, who's this guy who isn't telling me where this is coming from? So
right.
So yeah, I think it's, I don't know if I've clearly answered that. It's a difficult question, but yeah, I think it's becoming more difficult with competition.
I think part of the challenge, though, is not, I mean, we've been talking this whole time about verifying facts, about whether things are factual. And I get that that's on people's minds right now, because on a national political level, there is a lot of, let's say, trade in non-facts and unfactual information. And I get that. But on a local level, there really isn't. I cannot tell you, in more than 21 years in this business, who has actually straight up lied to me? Not that many people in local news, really not that many people. There are, however, in a local news, non-factual things people have told me, but usually it's repeating stories they've heard, repeating local, what becomes legendary, the
folklore and the
things that
hearsay.
make the story better.
Yeah.
The embellishments that make the story better. That is more common, I think, in local news than lies. Whereas if you were reporting in a Washington bureau, it would be a different story. I think what the big concern now that I hear is about bias, is not so much about people telling you something that is not true, about media just lying to you. I think more people are, and I would even call it paranoid, about media trying to nudge you in one direction or another. And I hear that all the time. I mean, we really work hard because we hear about it all the time. And we've got people giving us a hard time about it all the time. And we're trying really hard to set, biases aside and to call it straight and to show our work and to do those things. But I think that's largely the trick, the complication in our world right now. It's not so much that somebody's telling me something, that they're making something up. but they're trying to sway me in some direction.
There are two questions that were put into the chat. One says, can you address alternative facts and how there are two sets of media? The right has theirs and the left has theirs, and how some people won't listen to something in the New York Times, etc. Even it looks like with the vaccine, there are different media that say things. My friend was telling me that her friend, a nurse, believes a doctor who says all sorts of things that to me sound weird. As far as the vaccine is concerned, listen to your doctor, your personal doctor, listen to the CDC, listen to the World Health Organization. I wouldn't even listen to reporters. I mean, I love you all, but go with the medical professionals, because I didn't go to school for medicine, but the people who did, they've got this thing. So, stick with your personal medical professional when it comes to the vaccine and the coronavirus. And I'm sorry if I just stepped all over your.
But the news media may
response.
talk to multiple health professionals for a single story, whereas you're one single health professional. When you talk to three medical professionals or or county health departments or something like that, you may get a variety of opinions that may
Indeed.
fill things out a little more.
But I don't know that the media, and I'm using us collectively there, are really saying that much of a different story when it comes to the coronavirus. Honestly, the vaccines are the vaccines, and they're effective to multiple degrees, more so even than the flu vaccine. And I personally would recommend that anybody that has any reservations in getting the vaccine, talk to your doctor, because your doctor knows your medical history better than anybody else's. How do students feel their opinions are received by their teachers if they're in disagreement with their teachers' views in their discussions at school? Student panelists, you can chime in on that one. That one's potentially controversial.
I can go.
Sure.
Yeah, I'd say a lot of my teachers are really receptive to talking about different things. There are one or two teachers that will just say that they're right, but mostly in a joking manner. But yeah, most of them will really have a discussion. And then if it's really a debate, we will generally Google it and find a reputable source to check with.
Okay. Astrid or Libby, do you have anything significantly different than that?
I feel like most of the time the teachers are very willing to talk about our opinions, especially if they differ. I do have experience with one specific teacher who when we definitely have opinions that do not match. And if that topic is brought up, he tends to ask questions that will, in an attempt to refute any and everything that I'm saying. And it gets really frustrating because sometimes I don't even get to get a word. I can't even get a word in edgewise. It's like he tries to make it so that I cannot discuss the actual topic because he wants to be seen as right, even though the topic is something that I have a lot of experience in, and he does not.
That's challenging.
Yes.
Very challenging.
But most of the time, teachers are very open and willing to discuss differing opinions.
Okay, that's good. Libby, do you have anything to add?
From my personal experience, for the most part, a lot of the teachers are pretty accepting of our opinions and will listen to us. Some of the teachers don't like talking about stuff like that, so they'll just try to change the subject. But for most of the times that I've brought up my opinion, I felt pretty respected. And I have seen instances where there's very opinionated students, and usually what I notice is that the teacher usually just tries to refute them with some neutral facts that aren't going to like cause an argument, but they're just basically like, this is the facts, I'm not lying. And yeah, kind of settle everything down.
Okay. Well,
Could I say one more thing?
sure.
Yeah, I think a lot of my teachers really enjoy when we like challenge them on their facts because it makes them like think and research more, and it makes them enjoy their like that's why they do their job so that they can like really think deeply about different subjects. So
Agreed. Okay. I just want you to know that one of the people on our call is very impressed with the students and wants to thank you for being here. And I additionally want to thank you for being here. I am going to share my screen and a few more slides before we call this an evening. Let's see. So, speaking about news deserts, this was one of the questions from one of the participants on the call. News deserts. The United States has lost 1,800 newspapers from 2004 to 2018. Since 2018, the rate of newspapers closing or consolidating has actually increased. So, according to Professor Penny Abernathy from the Center of Innovation and Stability in Local Media at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, when you lose a small daily or a weekly, you lose the journalist who was going to show up at your school board meeting, your planning board meeting, your county commissioner meeting. Communities lose transparency and accountability, and research shows that taxes go up and voter participation goes down. So if you don't want to live in a news desert, and a news desert is where there is no local media that represents that community. I think your communities are very fortunate. You've got these 4 local media outlets, and there may be more. So you're not in a news desert yet, but there's always that possibility. Here are the personal emails for the professionals that were on today's call, including myself. So if any of you have a burning question that you did not ask while we were on this call, feel free to jot these down and contact us after the fact. We will do our best to respond because it's what we do. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get rid of that so quickly. But I'm just a Google away. And I want to thank, hold on, I'm going to share my screen one more time because I did want to thank the folks that were our sponsors and all the supporting organizations that made tonight happen. It would not have been possible without you all giving of your time and your energy. The students from Tupper Lake, Lake Placid, and Saranac Lake, thank you very much. What you had to say was important and we needed to hear it. I'm happy that you're interested in the news and you're following stories. I'm happier to find out that you're actually verifying information when you do see it on social media. Sharing bad information feeds the fake news monster. So please don't be that person. And when you find people in your life that are that person, do your best to educate them about finding the truth, at least finding the facts. Because as we said before, the truth is something that you can manipulate. Thank you so much for everyone's time and energy. Is there any other things that we need to say for the good of the order? This broadcast has been recorded, so people will be able to see this after the fact. It will be posted on North Country Community College's website, either later tonight or tomorrow. So you will have access to the recording. And hopefully I didn't say 100,000 times. So have a good night, everyone. Thanks again.
Thanks, Mary.
Yep, bye.